Hey, it's me, Moser, and we are going to compare mechanisms of evolution. This is notes for Evo1.2 Level 2. Let's go. So in this matrix, we've been looking at different mechanisms of evolution, such as natural selection, artificial selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, and founder effect. In other words, all the forces, all the ways that a population can evolve, all the things that can cause a population to evolve or shape its evolution. Great. Well, now we want to look at these 5 forces on populations and compare the effect of population size on any of them, the effect that these mechanisms have on genetic variation, and compare the source of selective pressure from each of them. Are we ready? Let's go. So first we'll look at natural selection, and in terms of the effect of population size on natural selection, it's not much. I mean, sort of. So you have to have some amount of variation to have natural selection happen, and variation can be limited in very, very small populations. Those very, very small populations can tend to be fairly homogeneous. That said, it doesn't really matter how big or how small the population is. If you're a bubblegum pink katydid, guess what? You're just going to get eaten the first time anybody sees you because everybody sees you. Right. So it doesn't matter how big or small the population is. There's nowhere to hide if you're a bright pink katydid. What about the effect of natural selection on genetic variation within a population? Well, honestly, natural selection can actually reduce genetic variation because, again and again and again, the winners tend to have certain genotypes. Certain alleles tend to become more common. So, it is quite possible for an allele to either become fixed in a population where everybody has it, or become lost in a population to the point where no one has it as a result of natural selection. But natural selection doesn't happen unless there is some variation in the population to begin with. This is a big old snake. It is a constrictor. It is a boa constrictor. You may have heard about these things. They're kind of running rampant in Florida to a point where in the Everglades it's actually estimated that constrictors have eaten about 80% of the mammals that used to live there. They do real well. What's interesting is that there have recently been some freeze events, some very cold events. And it turns out that there was some underlying genetic variation in the population of constrictors living in the Everglades. Some of them were way more cold tolerant than others. Guess what happened during the last cold snap in the Everglades? A lot of snakes died. 60% of them, actually. So did that limit the variation in their genetics in terms of cold tolerance? You bet ya. It was also a very strong selective event, so woohoo, they're more cold tolerant. Oh, great. So now let's talk about the source of selective pressure in natural selection. We're always thinking in terms of what's the selective pressure, what's the selective pressure? Well, for natural selection to occur, the selective pressure comes from the environment. It could be predators, it could be competition, it could be temperature, like with those boa constrictors. So, whether it is getting faster than your predator, whether it is being able to tolerate temperatures that are a little bit higher or a little bit lower than other members of your population, whatever it is, the environment exerts pressures on populations that change them. So, we got natural selection down. Now, let's shift gears to artificial selection. So, in artificial selection, what's the effect of population size? Well, remember here we're talking about populations of domestic animals or plants. This could be chickens, this could be goats, this could be apples or tomatoes, it could be potatoes, you name it, any domestic plant that humans have artificially selected over the years. What's the effect of population size? Well, again, selection requires variation. And if you have a domestic species that has a very small population, maybe it's limited to one geographic area, you can have a population that's too small to have much variation. So, that could be something like potatoes. And we've talked about the fact that at some points in history, humans have grown only one variety of potato in a given place. And that doesn't allow for a whole lot of variation. These beautiful things, by the way, are the wild ancestor species of potatoes. Aren't they cute? But not nearly as awesome as all the ones that we've selected from them. So what about the effect of artificial selection on genetic variation? Does it increase genetic variation? Does it decrease genetic variation? Well, as a matter of fact, artificial selection can increase genetic variation. Think about those potatoes that I showed you. We had one little ancestor wild species, and humans from that have created thousands of species. But when you breed to monoculture, you very often reduce genetic variation. Here's yet another example. There's our Indonesian jungle fowl. We talked about them a little bit earlier. And from that one species, humans over about 10,000 years have artificially selected for thousands of varieties of poultry. That's amazing and wonderful. We've really done a lot to increase the genetic variability of this species. But now we're kind of on the other end of that. This is the bird that 90% of the chicken produced in the U.S. comes from, a Cornish cross. And these guys are built to put on muscle really fast and to put on a lot of it. You can see that chicken looks pretty tough, but honestly, they're so muscle bound. Their breast muscles are so overdeveloped that they have that funny stance. They come to weight really quickly. Here's another example of a Cornish cross. You can see, my lord, she's got cleavage. These are very, very overdeveloped breast muscles to the point where they're not really functional for flight. When 90% of the chicken produced in a place is one particular variety, what we've done is breed to monoculture. Mono, of course, means one. Monoculture is when we're breeding down to a single variety, and that, of course, reduces genetic variation. What's the source of selective pressure in artificial selection? Well, you know this. It's human choice. It's human desire. Whether that desire is for a meaty chicken, whether that desire is for, beautifully colored potatoes. Human desires. Humans have been doing this agriculture thing for about 10,000 years. These are some Peruvian women sorting through potatoes, presumably looking for potatoes that will become next year's seed crop. These are some other humans doing more primitive forms of agriculture, and it looks like they are harvesting cassava bananas, maybe? I'm not sure. But yeah, humans over 10,000 years have developed this relationship where we drive the evolution of domestic plants and animals. Pretty cool. Okay, so let's talk about sexual selection now. So this is obviously, well, you remember what sexual selection is. What's the effect of population size on sexual selection? Does sexual selection not happen in really large or really small populations? Meh. Here's the deal. Mating is always going to happen. Now, the one thing that can happen is when you get down to a very small population, if there's really only one member of your species who's a potential mate for you, it doesn't matter if they've got the biggest, prettiest tail or the largest claw or the nicest rack. They're your only option, so mating will happen. Basically, individuals can be pickier in larger populations. This gets us to the case of Alaska, if you've ever heard the joke. So in a lot of parts of Alaska, males outnumber females by about 7-3. That's right, for every 3 females, there are 7 males. Well, what does that mean? They always say, ladies, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. Meaning that the kind of people who tend to go off to Alaska are a bit eccentric. Again, ladies in Alaska can be very choosy. Males in Alaska, not so much. What about the effect of sexual selection on genetic variation? Well, obviously, if there's no genetic variation, then there's no selection really happening. If everyone looks identical, has the same kinds of tails and claws and antlers and fur color and eye color and everything else, there is no selection. But what's interesting is that if one particular trait is really deemed as desirable by the opposite sex or by potential mates, we can actually see sexual selection reduce genetic variation over generations, as some traits just basically, the individuals that carry them get no lovin'. Is it possible that small clawed fiddler crabs, hey, you remember this question? That smaller clawed fiddler crabs could eventually just disappear altogether? No, probably not. I mean, some small crabbed fiddlers are obviously getting some mating success, but, is it possible that that trait becomes very rare? It is. Of course, what's the source of the selective pressure in sexual selection? Well, yeah, it's mates. Actually, I should say potential mates, because they're not mates until they've mated. Whether it's peahens who just can't resist a boy with a big, beautiful tail, or lady carp who look at the nest that this bad boy has made and say, ooh, 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 I want to lay my eggs there. The source of the selective pressure here is always about the individuals that someone might get to mate with, and making oneself or one's nest or one's light, in the case of lightning bugs, more attractive to those potential mates. So now let's talk about genetic drift. And you'll remember that genetic drift is the effect of random chance on allele frequencies. So is there an effect? Does genetic drift behave differently in different size populations? Oh yeah, the effect of population size with regard to genetic drift is enormous. As a matter of fact, in small populations, genetic drift is a big deal. And of course, you saw this with the simulator. We'll talk more about it later. But this is a simulation where we ran a population of 100 over 200 generations, and in probably half of them, the allele was fixed or lost in those 200 generations. Fixed meaning either everybody has it, or lost meaning nobody has it, it goes extinct. In a larger population with no selective pressure, allele frequency can stay at, a rough mix, 50-50, 60-40, for almost forever. Now, what's the effect of genetic drift on variation within a population? Well, again, it comes down to population size. In a small population, genetic drift can have a huge impact on genetic variation. In a big population, it's usually not that big a deal. Just as an example, if we have these two populations and randomly something comes along and kills off half of them, doop, doop. We're going to maintain more genetic variation in the larger population, just by virtue of the fact that there are more individuals with each phenotype. So what's the source of selective pressure in genetic drift? Ha! There is no selective pressure. It's all about random events, rolling the dice. Some days you're the windshield, some days you're the bug. There is no selective pressure. Genetic drift happens because some individuals are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it doesn't matter how good your genes are, you could just get hit by a car anyway. Oops. So now let's talk about founder effect. And I've drawn a cute little desert island there with 4 colored spheres. I don't know. So remember that founder effect is where population genetics are limited by the genetics of the founding population. So when we talk about founder effect and population size, we're talking about the size of the founding population. That's really critical. There's a huge difference between 5 people washing up on a desert island and 50 people washing up on a desert island. So small founding populations really equal big limits on diversity later. As an example, we could talk about Hawaii. So there are little islands all throughout the Pacific, and amazingly enough, native Pacific Islanders look very similar. Well, there's a reason for that. They were all founded by small founding populations that came from other Pacific islands. So we have small founding populations settling these little islands, and until we start to see a real influx of different genes later on in the last couple hundred years, those islands had very low genetic diversity. So what's the effect on genetic variation? Well, here's the deal. Low genetic diversity in the founders persists. So if you had an incredibly diverse founding population, maybe you took the most genetically different individuals you could to found a population. So you had as much genetic diversity as possible, even in a small number of individuals. That would pay dividends later on. When we have a small group of founders who are genetically pretty similar, we see effects from that for millions of years. So again, in the Polynesian populations and Pacific Island populations that haven't had a big influx of sort of outside genes, we see continued low diversity. Well, what about selective pressure and founder effect? This isn't really such a question with founder effect, because founder effect is more something that affects the evolution of populations at the start. Once you then go ahead and let that population keep moving forward on its own, any form of selection can occur, artificial, natural, sexual. It's not related to the founding population. It kind of happens on top of whatever diversity you've established. Okay, so let's talk about the experiences you've had in Level 2 so far. In the Skittles, or pseudo-Skittles as the case may be, lab, what was modeled? Well, natural selection for sure. If you were a rule-based predator, you were either eating the least camouflaged, the lightest colored, or the most camouflaged, the darkest colored Skittles first. And very often we see shifts in the population that push the distribution of color in one direction or the other. The Skittles lab also can show genetic drift. In cases where we had random predators and the random predators ate all colors, very often if we have a small founding population, colors get lost pretty fast. We also see founder effect in the Skittles lab. Smaller founding populations were prone, much more prone than larger ones, to having a loss of genetic diversity occur. Whether they were random predators or rule-based predators. Now, in the genetic drift simulator that you ran, remember that those small populations tended to see alleles lost or fixed pretty darn quickly. Remember, genetic drift is assuming that there's no selection happening. Here we've got a small population, 100, running for 200 generations in simulation, and what we see is that almost, I think 3 or 4, I must have run this 6 or 7, maybe 10 times, I think 3 of these get all the way to 200 generations, still maintaining both versions of the allele. In large populations, you can see allele frequencies staying fairly constant for a really long time. Again, if there's no selection and we're only talking about genetic drift. Here's a larger population. This was 10,000 individuals run for 200 generations. And as you can see, not a single one of those simulations, and again, I ran probably 10, 15 of them, not a single one of those populations lost or fixed this allele. Okay, do you feel fairly confident that you can compare these mechanisms of evolution and how they are affected by population size, what effect they have on genetic variation, and correctly identify and compare the source of selective pressure? I hope so, and if not, if you've got questions, you know what to do. Just ask.